last in this initial series of Courageous Conversations, in which we are going to be discussing the book White Fragility by Dr. Robin Diangelo. My name is Mary Ellen Daniels, and I'm the Civics Instructional Specialist for the Illinois Civics Hub at DuPage County ROE, and we are just delighted to have you here today. I am going to yield the floor to Dr. Darlene Rossetti to welcome you. She's our hostess for this evening, really had a vision of making all of this possible. So Darlene, please.
Hi, Mary Ellen. Hi to everyone and welcome. I'm Darlene Rossetti, the Regional Superintendent of Schools for DuPage County. So glad to be working with Mary Ellen and Shawn and others at Illinois Civics in providing these four part series to you. And this one is exciting, and we'll be planning more for you, after this evening. Well, you can find this and the other three Courageous Conversations sessions that we did on the DuPage County YouTube channel. There are a number of different type of opportunities there for you to view as well. I had mentioned earlier, if you were for our pregame show, last night we presented with Dr. Greg Wolcott. He wrote Significance 72, the author, and we had a conversation with lots of resources, lots of strategies in getting kids back to school, and both from an SEL lens and from an equity lens as well too. So please visit our website. And I just want to say, thank you for everything that you're doing. Thank you for today, this conversation that we're having. And this is really, we are really living in transformative times. And if not now, when? If not us, who? So I'm very excited. I just want to turn this over back to Mary Ellen and just thank you again for all of you for being with us here this evening.
Great, thank you, Darlene. I just want to briefly introduce our facilitator and panelists, just so you have a little bit of context of from what locations in the state they're coming from and the experiences they bring to this conversation. But also know that I'm going to be representing all of you that are viewing by sharing your questions and comments in the chat box with our panelists as well. So I'll be giving voice to you throughout this 1 hour conversation. Just very briefly, our facilitator for this evening is Dr. Shawn Healy. He leads the Robert R. McCormick Foundation Democracy Program, which seeks to strengthen democracy in Illinois through informed and engaged citizens and communities, vigorous and independent journalism, and responsive systems of government. Healy, I know what your name is. Healy chaired the Illinois Task Force on Civic Education in 2014 and later led the separate legislative campaigns for a required civics course in both middle and high school. He also led the Social Science Standards Task Force. He also serves as an adjunct professor in public administration at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Before joining the McCormick Foundation, he was a social studies teacher with me at West Chicago High School and at Sheboygan North High School. So brings a lot of different things to the table here. For our panelists, we have Wade Grinstead. He's a Chicago-based educational consultant dedicated to supporting the creation of learning experiences and spaces that honor a student's sense that I belong and my voice matters. Collaborating with district schools, teachers, and educational organizations, he provides professional development, instructional, and curriculum coaching in the intersecting worlds of social studies, civics, equity, social emotional learning, he's speaking your language, Darlene, and inclusion. He worked with Facing History and Ourselves for 8 years, supporting educators with resources and approaches to engage in meaningful ways with difficult histories and to make important connections to today. Prior to that, he taught high school history in New York City Department of Education for 9 years with an emphasis on civics and restorative justice. My friend, Dr. Bonnie Laughlin Schultz, taught high school in St. Louis area prior to earning her PhD in history. She was a James Madison Fellow, class of 1999, and graduated from Knox College with a BA in history and secondary education. She's the social studies teaching coordinator and associate professor of history at Eastern Illinois University, where she teaches social studies methods courses, as well as a U.S. history survey, women's history, research methods, and writing and courses in the online masters for teachers. It's a wonder she has time to be with us today. Dr. Laughlin Schultz organizes an annual conference for U.S. history, social studies educators, writes about the teaching of history and civics, and is presented at the Illinois Council for Social Studies, as well as other teaching conferences. And finally, last but not least, Tracy Freeman is a National Board Certified Educator in her 31st year of teaching, all but 5 in high school social studies. She's currently teaching AP US Government, US History, which is standards-based civics, and economics. She's the department chair at Normal West High School, representing the middle of the state. They're a democracy school and civically engaged students in school wherever possible. They host the annual Veterans Day dinner, career fair, and other student-initiated projects. And she has some great projects they're working on actually to deal with racial injustice and anti-racism coming up this school year that I hope she's able to share with us. She also is one of our Illinois Civics instructional coaches. Shawn, I don't know, this is going to be a great conversation. You've got some great panelists here, so I am going to turn the floor over to you and start ZJing the chat box here.
Thank you, Mary Ellen, and it's really a privilege. Good evening, everyone. Privilege to be with you this evening with this esteemed panel, and my job is mostly to get out of the way of them. So just a couple of words of introduction of this book, White Fragility. One, this afternoon, I was watching the press conference where Joe Biden introduced his running mate, Kamala Harris, made their first joint appearance. And he pointed to the fact that, and this is not to be a political statement at all, but pointed to the fact that today is the 3rd year anniversary since the Charlottesville event that is still, in my opinion, a kind of bleeding wound for our country, and was actually the inspiration for his candidacy. We're nearly 3 months away now from the murder of George Floyd, which of course has brought renewed and necessary attention to issues of racial justice. And the reality is, and I think this is maybe been made most pointedly clear by the work of the New York Times and the 1619 Project, we're 401 years away from the point when frankly, Black slavery was forever embedded in the heart of this country, and a system of white supremacy was built around that. So that's a lot of context. I would suggest now is as good a time as ever to have this conversation about white fragility, and I very much look forward to some of the questions from the folks who are attending. But we have a few that we've prepared. I had the opportunity a year and a half or so ago to lead a conversation at the McCormick Foundation. We're a really diverse organization from the perspective that we do grant making, but those of you in DuPage County are familiar with Cantini Park. We run a public park, and I actually led a conversation at Cantini Park for the staff there, and particularly staff in kind of middle and senior management, which is predominantly white. Like a lot of organizations, the lower ranks of that organization, and frankly, this is true of our downtown office too, are much more racially diverse. And led a really powerful conversation about white fragility that I think resonated with a lot of us. And if you haven't read this yet, please do, because I found myself replicating a lot of the behavior that is frankly put forth in this book, and are examples of my own white fragility. So I found it very helpful for that sense. We will look at this also with a critical lens, and also very much through the lens of how this applies in our schools, in our classrooms. And we have a fantastic panel to help us do that. So in the spirit of me getting out of the way, I'd like to answer or to ask the first question to our esteemed panel, and just a very basic kind of threshold question, which I think surfaces in the introduction of the book. Why is it so important to discuss race and racism in education with both educators and students? And Tracy, if it's okay, I'd like to start with you.
Yeah, thank you. I think if you do not explicitly discuss racism, you are inadvertently discussing it by not bringing up the topics. My high school made national news over the summer during e-learning, having some students express some very racist statements. It's kind of their statements to the press about my department, in particular one teacher, about other teachers within our building, was a slap in the face to see why we are not talking as professional educators about these topics. And again, raising the importance to having the conversations with the students. McLean County is not very diverse, yet we had a horrific thing occur. So I've spent a lot of time this summer with a group of professionals in my district and in the area, as well as with students. So yeah, I think if you don't explicitly bring that up, you might find yourself blindsided like our district was, but you're missing a great chance to avoid the type of awkward situation that we've had this past.
Thank you, Tracy. Bonnie, how does this apply to your context as you work with teacher educators?
So I
and
thought
specifically
about this,
future teachers.
yeah. So I thought about this a lot in terms of the social studies classroom, thinking about the ways that we, I think as social studies teachers and a preparer of social studies teachers, have particular lenses that we're obliged to bring to this. We're in a discipline where we talk a lot about informed action, about how to participate in civic life, make the world better. I don't see how we can do that if we're not acknowledging the very real thing that is racist belief and racist structure in America, and talking about how we encounter those in our schools and classrooms, and then what we're gonna do about it as we mold human beings that are gonna go out into this world. And I think I listened to a webinar recently where Stacey Abrams was talking about voter suppression. And she had this line where she was talking about how there is a real power in naming something and naming systems and naming problems and being explicit. And I think that's one of the cues in your question, that we have to be explicit about this. Just like Tracy said, if we're not being explicit, then we're actually doing something else implicitly that's the opposite of what we want to be about.
Thank you, Bonnie. And Wade, you've spent so much of your career helping educators think through how to grapple with issues of race and ethnicity and identity. Love to hear your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, thank you for including me on this panel, and thanks for everyone who's joining. I'm thinking about this question from my experience in the classroom, my experience working for an education nonprofit, my current role consulting, but also in my role as a student who grew up in a predominantly, overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, white suburbs of Chicago. And I remember early in my own teaching career, in some professional development, a question was asked of what was your first experience with race? And in my head, race meant non-white. And so how do I reframe my own thinking and support others in their thinking that whiteness is a part of our discussions about race? To your point, Shawn, about invoking 1619, white supremacy, naming something as white supremacy has been a part of our history since since the country's colonial inception. And so we need to be comfortable talking about these uncomfortable things and to provide ourselves and our students and our teachers tools to do that. I think about it from a civics lens. It's a question of democracy. How do we think about including people's voices in these conversations and helping people support the idea that, as I alluded to in that little bio, that I belong and my voice matters. We need, if we're not talking about racism and white supremacy, people who are impacted by racism are in either directly or indirectly excluded from the important conversations that are happening in schools. And I think that applies not only to the content we teach, but also to the ways our schools function in and of themselves. And how do we recognize and discuss that?
Thank you, Wade.
Just to get, I was just going to say a couple
Mariana.
things in the chat box.
Yeah.
my friend Tom Clark, shared that Dr. Kendi would say that if you're not speaking out against racism, you're complicit as opposed to being anti-racist. And he continues to say that I think we as teachers generally understand the issue, but it's a real powder keg of an issue, and it's easy to get the message twisted, which results in negative feedback from administration and even maybe community. Ellen shares that for years people didn't talk about race and claimed to be colorblind. It obviously hasn't worked. Let's try talking about it. And then finally, Stephanie, and thank you for these comments, a majority of teachers in this country are white. If we don't learn about and then teach about the racism that our students currently undergo, we're doing them a disservice. We're allowing white teachers and students to continue thinking that this is a non-issue. And then Mike DeNovo shares that to develop constructive public discourse, race and racism needs to be explicit in our curriculum. We need to learn how to do that. And that is for social studies classrooms specifically, and more generally, our public schools. The civic purpose of schools calls for it. And one last one, Virginia, as a kindergarten teacher, it's important to teach race and racism to students at this age because they already show many of the same racial attitudes that adults in our country hold. So I think some really rich comments there from our attendees as well that maybe you panelists can build upon. Thank you.
Yeah, these views set in very early, and I especially appreciate Ellen's comment and I think it's important to say that we, as white people and white educators, need to grapple with our own whiteness. That's one of the privileges of white supremacy, is that we are not forced to grapple with these issues. So we had the question last week as we talked to teachers about how do we teach about race. What if I have a class that doesn't have any or few students of color? Is this something I still need to address? And we said absolutely. So next question, and want to get specifically into chapter 2, where Diangelo lays out racism and white supremacy. And Diangelo was actually scheduled to give a talk right around when the pandemic hit at Evanston Township High School. Instead did the webinar online June 12th and had something like 8,500 people participate. And Mary Ellen may, if she hasn't already, may pop the link into the chat box. It's definitely worth a watch, really well facilitated by the assistant superintendent in Evanston. Basically in this webinar, the author asked several questions about racial socialization in schooling in the book, and reflected on this in the webinar. She said in the webinar that schools are hostile water for students of color if we fail to address the quote unquote whiteness and structural racism undergirding them. Is she right, Bonnie?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. I think that the National Council for History Education last week had something that they called an equity summit. And it was powerful. And a lot of the videos are up on their website. But the most powerful thing I heard was a student who is going to be a high school senior, identified herself as a biracial student and talked about her experience of schooling. And I don't know how anybody could listen to this thoughtful girl and hear, I mean, just pain in her voice about the ways that school had failed to meet her needs. And it really, I was driving and listening to it, and I almost had to pull over because it was so powerful. And to figure out, okay, what are the operating assumptions of these schools? What are these barriers? And even for her, some of it was just simply not being represented in the literature, the history that she was being taught. And I think that those stories are all out there, and we shouldn't really need to even hear these stories to know what our schools are, because we know their origins. We know, like you all have been saying, that whiteness is sort of the default. So of course this is true. The other thing I would add, I found last week, Amber, in one of the previous webinars, used this metaphor of a garden to talk about school and meeting the needs of students. And I found that really a helpful way. And I think to some of the questions about how do you talk to even parents about this, right, that I saw in the chat, I found that very useful, that it sort of it made something so self-evident that in many ways feels very complicated to us when we talk about it.
And Tracy, I may be skipping ahead a little bit, but if I could just pick up, maybe feel free to weigh in specifically on the question, but we have a later question where you posed to me, what do we tell parents when we're discussing issues of race and racism in our classroom? And they said, why are you doing this?
Yeah, we've had the question of our, kind of what the author talks about, the reverse, the denial, the why is this coming up, you're causing problems type of conversations. Again, social studies, we get away with it a little bit more than some of my colleagues across the hall in the English department that try to diversify their curriculum. And I think it's safe to say my administration isn't always very supportive. If it's not on the curriculum map, stick to it, and then you can dodge those. But as far as this quote in this slide, I can't agree more. I think of things, again, I've read this summer that they talk about, feeling belonging and feeling that you're part of the system. And Teaching Tolerance just sent a printable poster that says, you have to harvest and cultivate our own stories, not just to feel valued, but to feel rejoiced, and making sure that you're part of that story. Just today, I had a conversation with a colleague that he said, how in the world am I supposed to bring more of Black history in when I teach from World War II to the present? I can't talk about this. I can't talk about, and I stopped and just looked over his shoulder at his Teddy Roosevelt poster and his poster of, I said, we all find ways to bring things that we think are important into our daily lessons. And to say that it's not in the chronology or the time frame, first of all, I think is ignorant. I use nicer words. But second of all, I think it's a disservice. It's a lie. We can do it, and we owe it to our students to do that. So Bonnie's story of the students, again, hitting in the face, our local radio station is doing a series called Growing Up Black in Bloomington Normal, or Living Black in Bloomington Normal, and to read their stories, and it's cringing. It's like you said, Bonnie, the students sharing. So again, even if you want to say, no, this is not true, you will find the stories to tell you that our own, our white privilege is showing in that answer. So.
Wade, I'm particularly interested in the work that you're doing addressing social and emotional development of young people. Love, your broader perspective on this, but maybe you could speak to that specifically.
Yeah, this is so important, and I think to think about those intersecting worlds of social emotional learning and equity and civics. Tracy, I was so appreciative of you talking about students in Bloomington Normal talking about their experiences. I was going to mention there's a whole series. This applies more to independent or private schools, but like a whole thing on Instagram of Black at what name, fill in the name of the independent school across the country, and what their experiences have been like being in a relative minority in those spaces. And so how do we, looking at those intersecting worlds of equity and social emotional learning, if we want to understand and address the social awareness and self-awareness of students, we need to think about identity in those moments. We need to think about the ways in which either our identity puts us in a place of privilege or puts us in a place of marginalization, and how do we foster important dialogue around that? How do we create the spaces in our classrooms through contracting or norms or whatever we want to call them to create, quote unquote, brave spaces so that we are reflective in this? And I think in that Family Action Network video, there's a really, powerful story. Diangelo kind of flips and asks the administrator, who is a Black man, a question what's this like for you? And so it's hostile water, not just for the students in the building, but also any teachers of color in the building. Diangelo highlights this. I think Nicole Hannah-Jones, who writes a lot about race and education, talks about the like one of the more problematic aspects is the like self-identified, white progressive or white liberal who thinks they've got it figured out. And, they kind of speak in ways to Black colleagues or colleagues of color, in ways that like implies that they think they understand everything, rather than having what they call in that conversation, like racial humility, and recognizing that we all have work to do in this process. Like it's not like a 75-minute anti-bias training is going to check the box and we're done with that work. Like we need to stick with this work for the sake of our students, for our own sakes, and our own longevity in this work. Because as Beverly Daniel Tatum talks about it, like this is a smog that's all around us. Like we can't help but breathe it. And so like, what are the intentional things? And I'm kind of getting to like, what are the things we do piece, but I think there's a lot of intersections here, like recognizing this work needs to be consistent to foster those spaces for our students that makes them feel like they are a part of the broader school system. And, that has impact not only on their well-being, but on democracy, on performance in school, all of the things that are important to educators and administrators.
And I think before I go to Mary Ellen and ask for what's popping up in the chat box, one point that if I could take from what you said, Wade, and also from the book, is as white educators, the responsibility for self-improvement's on us. It's not the responsibility of our diverse colleagues. Often we look to them by default to be kind of the go-to person on race, frankly, to be the go-to person to interact with students of color. That burden is on us, not them. I think that's a really important takeaway. Mary Ellen, what are other people saying?
Sure, just a couple of comments. Thomas Clark shares that teachers experience white fragility just like anyone else. If we're not comfortable with the topic, then we're more inclined to give it short shrift. Rosa Basio shares that we in Illinois, we're quite segregated, and some schools have high population of students and staff that are people of color, but we don't interact or connect with other schools where the majority of the community is white. Ina shares that as teachers, we have to be open to talk about hard topics such as racism, and foreign both populations have many difficulties in life. And Michelle agrees with some of the points that were made by the panelists here. She talks about how, let me see here. Oh, I just went down too much. She completely agrees. She's a first-generation Hispanic that's in her 40s and still has not seen a dramatic shift in the high school curriculum. Yvette, when students, other teachers in the community are not supportive, how do teachers provide support to students of color? So I think maybe we'll come to that in a little bit. And finally, when students, other teachers in the, our community, blah, 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 blah. Oh, and Thomas, to reply to what Wade just shared, grrr. I hope I gave that enough intonation. We're seeing this in the Black Lives Matter movement, white progressive cops opting the movement. So, and thank you for saying that, Shawn, where the burden really lies. So with that, let's go on to the next question.
Thank you. And thanks to all those of you contributing to this conversation. It makes it much more interesting. I think we'd all agree. So this gets to an earlier point that I was making. Chapter 4, the author writes, it has not been African Americans who resist integration efforts. It's always been whites. And I pulled this question in particular, or asked this question because many of the folks that are tuned in here today, I'm in DuPage County, suburban Chicago. We have a large suburban Chicago audience, I know, where frankly our landscape is a product of a generation or two ago from white flight from the city of Chicago. And I'm interested in particular, I think this applies probably everyone has a perspective on this. Bonnie, you were in the St. Louis area. Tracy, there are communities of color in the Bloomington Normal region. And then Wade, given your experiences both in New York and in the Chicago area, I'm interested in how white flight impacts your schools. Is this something that we ever talk about in the classroom setting? And the follow-up to this, what assumptions or biases are held about a changing population? It's fair to say now, as we look everywhere in our state, right, as of a couple of years ago, a majority of our students now in K-12 are students of color in Illinois. So this isn't just a Chicago region phenomenon. Let's start with you, Wade.
I think my first response actually, I'm going to reflect, I mentioned before, like my experience as a student, and I remember learning about like, you know, post-war 1950s suburbanization, and there's this narrative about the growth of the suburbs and the highway system and the GI Bills and the ways in which suburbs grow, and it's a part of this kind of progress narrative that, you know, we teach or we're taught or may perpetuate as well, but I didn't learn anything about, you know, who was excluded from those GI Bills, about the ways in which, you know, racial restrictive covenants were written into a lot of suburban tracts, like the iconic Levittown. So how do we understand the formation of these spaces and the normalization or the perceived neutrality of whiteness? You know, like growing up in a white suburb and working with suburban schools, and, you know, we kind of, I'll speak for myself, you know, there's this assumption of like, this is just the way it is, rather than understanding how and why these communities were created. We think about stories like the killing of Mike Brown or Ahmaud Arbery or Trayvon Martin, and the role that space played in those stories. And we talk about the moment in and of themselves, but we don't talk about how and why those spaces look the way they do. And I think that's really important, you know, to the point earlier that was raised in one of the questions about like, that Tracy raised about her colleague, and like, I don't have time to teach X, Y, and Z. Like, I think we need to prioritize this. So like in my work with schools, both in the city of Chicago and in the suburbs, like gentrification, like increasing whiteness in some neighborhoods, or you know, a predominantly white community that is experiencing you know, an influx of an immigration population or other BIPOC populations, like we need to talk about and think about those things, and not just operate under the assumption that you know, the default whiteness of that space is what's normal. We need to think about how and why these spaces look the way they do.
Thanks, Wade. Tracy, how does this play out in Bloomington Normal?
Well, in Bloomington Normal, we have, I teach in Unit 5, which is literally a donut hole, originally an agrarian school district around the city of Bloomington. So you want to see this impacted and brought up. You just mentioned the word merger again with my colleagues in Bloomington Normal, and both sides have a negative reaction. Our district, we actually teach the Boston busing in our semester history. We do an inquiry and have the students assess, and we always introduce that by showing our redistricting within Unit 5 of our schools. And kids are shocked to find out that from the south end of town, they're bused to our high school. And so we talk about why. And I found many analogies in the White Fragility where students will say, well, yeah, that's just for the social class, or that's just for, and they're missing the different ways they're trying to balance our middle and high schools. They're not seeing the racial imbalances and trying to keep things equitable. So we see it in McLean County. We don't see people necessarily moving out of well, I guess a little bit we do. I guess you could argue that's what Tri-Valley and Downs and some of our neighboring communities are, but for the most place, as not as much. But I do think that I intentionally talk to my students about code words and, you know, what does it mean when someone says, well, that's an urban district? Mm-hmm. And what do you mean I don't want to live on the west side of town? What does that mean? Our high school is on the west side. So what do realtors say about our high school compared to our sister school? And so they're really pretty frank. And that's one positive way that I get a lot of my students who sometimes remain extremely quiet to get invested, because they feel that I don't want to be grouped as a bad school and a bad this or that. And we talk about, well, why is that? And so the kids can be really honest about it until, like the author says, you're pointing asking them to look internally, but it's a great way to start having some of those conversations, I think, around that. So we do see it, and they're sometimes oblivious to it.
Thanks, Tracy. But Bonnie, a few years ago, I looked at a study that kind of showed the pipeline for teachers in Illinois, and there were a lot of teachers that we poll pre-service candidates from the Chicago region, and they go to college at ISU, they go to U of I, they go to Eastern, and then often they come back to teach in the Chicago area. So yeah, fascinated to hear about the types of teachers that go through your program and how you might address issues like this to prepare them for a variety of settings where they're going to go and teach.
Yeah, so I would say our students are probably still about half and half of them from Chicago and the suburbs, about half of them from various spots in downstate Illinois, and then increasing some students from other states. And, we do a lot of work now because there is such a teacher shortage in rural schools about preparing students to teach in rural schools and actually doing some specific work about what does it mean to teach in a basically homogenous school and what is the work that you need to do there, as well as students coming back to Chicago. But I also, I was thinking about this with your question, because we think about this sort of as a school issue. And yet for students who come to college, it's not just a climate of the school or climate of the university, it's also the climate of the community. And so we are not a city and have not experienced sort of white flight down here. Instead, I would say what we've experienced is more a response to a better recruitment of a diverse student body, and have to think a lot about code words. Like down here, sometimes the code word Chicago means a student of color, right? That things were this way, and then they got those kids from Chicago. And you hear that in town. And so I think that it's, in some ways, well, it's all complicated, but as complicated as a high school setting, because you're not just talking about sort of the things that a university has control over, you're also talking about the specific region. I also, to divert from your question to me, I thought a lot when I was thinking about this, and really in the past few years. I grew up in St. Louis, and I grew up in very different from Wade, actually, that I grew up in the northern county part of St. Louis. I grew up in Ferguson and in the town next to it, Florissant, and sort of grew up in a time of extreme white flight from those areas, particularly from Ferguson, and folks moving over the river where you could get more house for your money. And that was the way that was talked about. But I would say, Wade was saying, well, we didn't really talk about why our school looked this way. I mean, that was true for us too, right? That you just sort of were like, oh, this is how it is. And we live in a more integrated way, but school felt very segregated, the cafeteria and even the neighborhoods where people lived. And it's been very interesting to me in the past few years about these assumptions and biases. And when Mike Brown was killed and all the talk about the Ferguson that I grew up in, but also talk about a Ferguson that I didn't know because I was white, right? And so I didn't have to sort of know some of those things. And I think all that stuff is at play with this discussion too.
Mary Ellen, any more feedback in the chat box? You're muted.
Pardon me. I'll just give a couple here because I know we have a lot of questions to go, but Jim shares, teaching in a predominantly white district 90 miles east of St. Louis, there's a preconceived notion of East St. Louis by my students. I've used the first chapter of Savage Inequalities dealing with East St. Louis for them to grasp the concept of white flight and its repercussions. It's a very difficult concept to explain to high school in the middle of Southern Illinois, cornfield with less than a 3% minority population to grasp. Mike shares that he's a big believer and supporter of social studies education through inquiry and concepts, but some historical events and processes need to be taught. I think the absence of teaching racially restrictive covenants and redlining allows for the belief that any individual and community can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. The reality is that the suburbs were built with policies that favored whiteness at the expense of non-white people and communities. Most people I find are totally unaware of the history about housing policies in America. Code words, the neighborhood is changing. And then there's a couple of other recommendations for books. Wade recommended Richard Rothstein's Color of Law. And then finally, Rosa shares, there's so much trauma in predominantly Black and brown communities, and teaching about race can sometimes be hard. I think the issues that students experience in predominantly white schools are in some ways different. For instance, the high school I taught in Chicago struggles with gun violence, gangs, domestic violence, and homelessness. However, when I was teaching at the suburb school, students didn't struggle much with that, but had high levels of anxiety and depression. And Thomas says truth. So just with those comments there before we move on.
And maybe I can cue this up. So appreciate all the comments. Would love to see some of the questions you have for the panelists. So I'll ask one more question of them and use this intervening time if we could multitask for you to pose some additional questions that are beyond the ones I'm asking. And shout out to Savage Inequalities. Chapter 2 is about Chicago. I used to use that with my students, but yeah, I think chapter 1's on East St. Louis, and that's particularly powerful. So I actually, any good book discussion isn't just a love fest. So I'd love to weigh in a bit on some of the criticism. I'm sure Mary Ellen will also share this link for a story that appeared in The Atlantic last month titled The Dehumanizing Condescension of White Fragility. And just to pull out one passage in particular that I think resonated with me and is worthy of some discussion here. And if you're just listening, I'll read it. Author said, and herein is the real problem with white fragility. Diangelo does not see fit to address why all of this agonizing soul searching is necessary to forging change in society. One might just ask how people can be poised for making change when they may have been taught that pretty much anything they say or think is racist is thus antithetical to the good. What end does all this self-mortification serve? Impatient with such questions, Diangelo insists that wanting to jump over the hard personal work and get to solutions is the foundation of white fragility. So this balance between the work we have to do internally and the work is out there. In other words, for Diangelo, the whole point is the suffering. And note that the scare quotes around solutions, as if wanting such a thing were somehow ridiculous. What do you think about this question and this point, Bonnie?
So I've read a number of critiques of Diangelo. I agree with many of the points of critiques, and I see many valid points here. I wonder about the word suffering though, because I wonder, like, I was thinking about this book and sort of what is it that it's trying to get white people to do? Because I agree, I am frustrated by the lack of sort of a call to action here, right? That we want white ladies to stop it with the tears, right? But what do we want them to do instead, right? When you stop that and you understand why you're doing that. And I feel like there's a way that this book is really sort of just trying to get people to be still and listen. And I think she believes, I don't see, again, I agree with the critique, but I don't see the mechanism in the book for sort of getting from the listening to the what next. But I think the operating assumption sort of is if you're listening, if you're able to hear, then you will feel the need to act, to become somebody. In the chat box earlier, it said, you know, that to understand that that you can't just not be racist or think that you're working through that. You have to be anti-racist, that you have to be actively trying to dismantle this system here, and to, you know, say that white people need to do some of this work. Yeah.
Thank you. That's great. Wade, what do you think?
Like Bonnie said, I've read some critiques. You know, I some of what McWhorter says provoke me a little bit. You know, but you know, they make me ask questions of myself as well. I think I would call it to task. Like, I think what Diangelo's work does has to do, which I think McWhorter is dismissive of, is that reflective piece. I think we need, like, what the book does is it frames what white supremacy and white fragility look like in ways that I can, like, as you said before, I think, Shawn, that like you recognize the things you do. I like to think to myself as a reflective educator, and yet, like, I do a lot of the stuff that she talks about, and I need to grow within that work, and I may not see it without reading it. I think, early in the book, one of the critiques is that, like, she as a white woman is perhaps capitalizing on this equity work and making money where a lot of other Black scholars are doing very similar work, if not preceding this work. And she does name check a lot of them, and that's important. But, like, how do we recognize the voices that are a part of this work and put them at the forefront? Like Layla Saad's Me and White Supremacy, or So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluwa, as two texts that do similar things to this, but not totally the same. And from the perspective of that, and I think it's important in the context of this panel. The book is written to white people. This panel is white folks, or I don't want to speak for anybody on the panel, but I'm identifying the group as being a white panel, and that may be important in the context of talking about white fragility. But how do we name those kinds of things in these conversations? And without that reflective piece, we can't move towards the proactive solutions. I too would like to see more solutions, but I think that reflection and understanding is a part of the solution, because it's long-term work.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Wade. It may well be the reason that this book has had such resonance is it's written by a white person, that we are more willing to take on this message for that reason. What say you, Tracy?
Well, just to add on, I think I agreed. I was nodding, and I found I've read Dr. Kendi quite a bit that she quotes, and this article quotes as well. And there's a lot that would point issue with what she mentions in her book. But I think her being a white woman lets her write some of the things in the book and widens the audience for that book much more so than some other authors, especially authors of color, which goes to her point that we shouldn't be turning to just people of color to have this conversation. We had a district-wide book club about this, and the comments that people made and how they internalize it, I think it's easier for them to take coming from her. And I think it is, although this I think is a very valid, and boy, he ripped apart The Blind Side and some of my movies that I thought I liked so much, but I think it's very valid points. But I do still think the book serves a purpose. It definitely makes you, as someone in the chat book said, if you pick it up and read it, you're definitely going to be nodding at some things and internally reflecting. So although I think it's very valid criticism, I think the book still has value in the conversations that it has people having around a lot of different groups and topics. So
I have a couple of white colleagues who read this book and proceeded to apologize to some of our colleagues of color for the way they've interacted in the past, to Wade's point.
I'm a crier. So I get emotional with everything. So when I was meeting with our students of our Black Student Union, I said right up front, if I get emotional, just ignore me, because that's just my coping mechanism, but let's have a talk. And it was really candid, and the kids that I had in class laughed and said, oh yeah, she cries at commercials, leave her alone, kind of to put it in the reference that is not an attention seeking thing in this way. So it really opened my eyes to some things, even personally, that, oh my gosh, I don't think I'm doing that for attention, but that's my reaction sometimes. And I need to maybe watch that in certain conversations.
If you haven't thank you for that. If you haven't read the book, there's a whole chapter on white women crying. So encourage you to read it. Mary Ellen, are any questions that our panel can respond to that have surfaced?
Not too many questions, so I'm just going to give voice to some comments, and maybe we'll get a few more questions. To kind of go back to what we were talking about previously, but it builds on what we're talking about now. I want to give voice to what Juan said. He says, I'm a foreigner, and I noticed that people I live with want to move to the suburbs because of the violence of the Antifa was reaching their area where we live. So if there are more people moving to be safe, the schools, I think, are going to have change in their population. And Tom responds, good point. A district where I worked experienced a relatively quick change in demographics from upper white students to middle white and Black students. The district scores faltered and it blamed the kids instead of blaming the system, which wasn't meeting their needs. But if you're living in white fragility, as Tracy just quoted, the book will be an affront if you even pick it up in the first place. Again, the complaint is her with her work mainly is capitalizing monetarily. Michelle wanted to kind of reflect on what was said. It's tough perspective because the white leader has to change society. So what's being described is that more people are willing to listen because of the color of the author. That's really sad to hear. And there are more white perspectives out here besides Dr. Diangelo's that we could also reference. There's a lot of agreement to that. And then finally, is it not her point that we need to learn how to hold conversations about race in order to move forward in a progressive way? If we continue being so fragile, we will not come around to the idea that it's necessary to move our society forward in an anti-racist way. I don't think there's an easy solution or checklist to becoming an anti-racist society where actual justice and equity exists. So
I'm not sure if that was a rhetorical question, but I think it is.
Let's take it. That's as close to a question as I have right now.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear the other panelists, but I'm thinking specifically of some of Howard Stevenson's work, and he talks about the racial elephant that in our schools we dance around. We rarely address. Frankly, we're scared of it. We don't know how to do this well, and I think that's why I asked if it was rhetorical, because this type of work, this type of self-reflection, I think as educators gets us in a better place to be able to facilitate that conversation with our students. But would love to hear from the other pros on our panels. Any thoughts about that question?
I was gonna say, you know, I feel like one of the things that this book helped me put a name to is that sensation of, I teach the first half of the US survey. So we start wherever we start and we end in Reconstruction. And, you know, I have 35, 40 students in a room. They've gone to high school, they've taken US history. So they sort of know what we're gonna encounter, and sort of, you know, when we start talking about slavery, when we start talking about removal of Indigenous people, I used to note, like, I would just call it this look on their face of just the starting to shift and eyes down. And we do okay for the first few days when we talk about slavery, and then we've had it, we can't do it. And, you know, I eventually would try to just sort of stop and be like, okay, so I see this thing going on. Can we talk about this thing going on? And I feel like maybe not so much this book. I mean, the book helps me name it as this fragility in our students, probably worsened by the fact that I'm in a position of power talking to them about this. So we are not equals having this conversation. They don't feel free to sort of manifest that feeling. They just start squirming and looking around. And I feel like that trick of sort of naming that feeling that's happening and sort of saying this thing is going on in the room, here's why we need to push through this thing that's going on in the room, is something that's really important. And I would not say, you know, like everything else about this, I am very much trying and messing up and trying and, you know, reading what I can. But I think that trick of, you know, okay, when we talk about race, I feel X, and then let's name how might people in this room feel? And then students don't even have to name their own feeling, right? Here's some feelings we might, okay, now we've done that thing. Now let's move on. And I think it's very hard. It took me, like when I first started teaching social studies teaching methods, I would always put a day on my syllabus of teaching about race in US history. And I will admit, the first 2 years I managed to get behind and I couldn't do it. I chickened out, right? Because it was hard. I felt like I didn't know what I was doing. I was scared. You know, that was awful on my part, right? And I still feel like I'm not quite sure how to do this right, but I know this is one of the most important things that we're gonna do this semester, particularly because I'm modeling for my students what I hope they will become in the classroom. So I don't know if that addresses the question a little bit, but I think that sensitivity in our students, as well as in ourselves, is really important to name and try to figure out what the strategies.
I appreciate your self-reflection and humility on that, Bonnie. Your thoughts, Wade or Tracy?
I mean, just from that, I'm kind of like threading together a little bit of the original question, a little bit of what Bonnie said, and something Michelle asked about, like, you know, this kind of this good bad binary around racism. Like, you know, I think, you know, as I've said, as we've all said, like, I think reflection is really important in this. I think about when I was a newer teacher and I, you know, was talking about race, like some moments I would just swat it aside because I didn't know what I was talking about. But then, like, I had been to grad school and I had some good resources on slavery, and I, like, you know, I put some stuff in front of my students without helping them understand what they were going to see that was, like, ultimately damaging. Like, I didn't talk about resilience. I talked kind of a victim narrative about the horrors of slavery, which is there, but, like, without any sense of agency for the people impacted there. And so, like what is the role that I have, and how is it that to Michelle's point, like, how do we think about race, racism, white supremacy in this discussions we have as not being a binary, things that Diangelo and other people talk about, like, you know, the perception of, like, racism means, like, saying the N-word and wearing a white hood versus, like, the everyday things that we all perpetrate. I was in some setting once having a conversation where, like, somebody just raised a really good point. Like, for me and the various privileges I hold in moving through the world, like, I'm going to get stuff wrong. And pretty much the worst thing that can happen when I get stuff wrong is somebody's going to call me racist. And, like, that's, you know, I need to be able to hold on to that and recognize that this conversation is going to be messy, and like, people are going to call me out, and I need to, you know, have that humility to, like, learn and grow from it and hear where people are, and to recognize I do not have all the answers.
And that kind of is a nice segue to what we are doing after meeting with our BSU students. We are going to try to increase individual teachers within our district's knowledge base. I said, I do think sometimes, especially at the elementary, the kids said all we ever had for any type of diverse history was Dr. King and Ruby Bridges. That's it, nothing else, nothing. And every single year, and so I said, well, I believe that many teachers themselves just don't know what else to do. So they're trying to provide those resources. And then that's the other message my students have had this summer in the conversations with me, is that to have the humility and the honesty to say, I don't know. And to apologize for mistakes you make. She tells a couple stories of that in the book, but even with your students. And that's why, I mean, we've invited our students into our department to share concerns they have with our department in the same conversations as we're having these conversations in our class. My department is 11 white teachers. So how can we better advocate for our students and to give them a voice? And I think that's what we can provide as educators. Someone asked early on, how do you advocate for students? I said, you have to listen and be honest and say, I make mistakes, and publicly apologize, and all those things she does talk about. And those are some of the positives of the book. And again, if you don't do that and you avoid it and you turn the other cheek and you skip it, you're going to can very well end up with some social media blitz calling it to your attention that, hey, you've got a problem in your community that no one wants to talk about publicly.
Well, thank you for that question. It was presented a rich conversation. Mary Ellen, are we going back to Darlene to bring us home?
Absolutely. So we'll see if Darlene can get back on with us.
I'm here. Hi. Oh my gosh, that was so good. I was taking notes. And I was one of the things I was thinking about as you were all talking was, you know, I loved your honesty but I was thinking of all the action words you brought to the table. And that's one of the things, like, you talked about listening, you talked about giving voice, you talked about, you know, reflecting. But I want to tell you my big takeaway and I think it was you, Tracy, that said this, so this is personal for me, push through. So that's I love that as a great action word. Let's push through and let's continue to push through. So thank you all very, very much for tonight, for all the work that you do. And I hope that we can be together again. Thank you.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions we didn't get to in the chat box. So I realize a lot of people have to sign off right now at 7 o'clock, but if a few of our panelists could stay behind maybe 5 minutes or so, maybe we could get to a little bit of after-hour chatting here. Otherwise, thank you so much for your participation, and I will be sharing out a copy of the chat box with resources in a post email probably sometime tomorrow morning, if not tonight, okay? So thank you very much, and now into the after-hours show. So if we could just, yes, I am the after hours ZJ here. I just wanted to give voice to something that was shared by one of our participants here. She says, I'm an African American. I really do appreciate the honesty and insight from this panel. It's been very interesting hearing how this topic and movement is being perceived by colleagues that do try to get it, acknowledge the shortcomings, but learn from them at the same time. So I appreciate that comment. So there was a very simple question here from Michelle a little bit earlier. How do we get people to shift from the good-bad mentality pertaining to racism? That's something that really Diangelo unpacked in her book. Would any of you want to how did you think about that comment?
Wade, I thought you articulated it well. I'm happy there's a whole chapter on it in the book, but I thought you articulated it well earlier in the conversation. Thoughts on how we can?
Yeah, I mean, recognizing that racism isn't one thing. There's a whole variety of ways we think about racism. I think one thing I would add to what I said before is that, like, a lot of times we perceive racism as solely the actions of individuals and not naming the structural and institutional aspects of racism. So how do we name those things as well as a part of it? And then yeah, as I said before, recognize that we can get, like, we meaning white people doing this work may and can and should get called out at times for this, and that's okay. And, like, yeah, I think Diangelo and other people talked about, like, it's not like it's not a core character flaw of your being. I mean, egregious racism, that's a separate conversation. I think sometimes we default too much to, like, who the Richard Spencers are versus, like, I can recognize that growing up in a racist society and system, I can and say and do racist things, and I'm going to get it wrong, and I need to name it, and I need to learn from it, I need to listen, and I need to grow from it, and hopefully I won't do it next time, and hopefully I'll have the courage to name it when white folks or other privilege holders in other contexts, if we're thinking about intersectionality, can and say and do things, like, how do I use I was gonna say, how do I use my privilege to challenge those things? And I'm gonna pin that just for a second to say, I just saw somebody say something to the effect of, like, when people say or ask the question, how can I use my privilege to challenge X, Y, or Z? There's an assumption that you want to maintain and uphold your privilege, and you don't want to dismantle that privilege. So that was a real important reflection for me to hear from that comment.
I would add, I appreciate your point about systemic racism, looking specifically at schools, right? And race is an artificial construction, but if you can look at the history of how we created schools to Americanize Native Americans, the battles over schools when Chinese Americans first came to the West Coast, for example, similar battles in the Southwest with Mexican Americans, and then clearly something we do teach when we touch on Ruby Bridges is the segregated institutions for African Americans. But the K-12 as it's constructed is very much a system, unfortunately, of white supremacy. And yeah, what do we do to dismantle some of those elements that are still very much in place?
Shawn, I think one thing I would add to that list of, like, racist and white supremacist things that impact schools is understanding the role of eugenics in sorting people and creating standardized tests. Like any tracking that we have in schools, sometimes tracking, I mean, that's a bigger question, like the role of tracking, but tracking and standardized tests are rooted in eugenics thinking, which is overtly white supremacist and very little studied in this country and with tremendous impacts.
And I think Facing History has some things about the history of eugenics and such in their resource site for people. Do we have time for one more question? Yeah, this was asked much earlier by Yvette Justice, ironically, what a perfect name. And we touched on this a little bit. Maybe we can get more specific because it gets into that like next steps thing. When students, other teachers in the community are not supportive, how do teachers provide support to students of color when we have these conversations, when we study this hard history? Wade, you talked a little bit about, you know, maybe in the past how you didn't do that well initially, like that wasn't your intention, but that was the impact. So how do we have that positive impact, and how do we acknowledge those lived experiences of the students in our school, but yet we don't want to exploit that, make that an object lesson necessarily? So any thoughts on that by the panel?
I think for all of our students that are underrepresented, whether it's our pride group or any student of color or anything, I try to approach in our staff and my immediate staff the acceptance and the idea of not shunning anyone from the story. Same thing in class, you know, formalizing, this is what we mean by prejudice, this is what we mean by discrimination. I'm one of the older members of our staff, so no one has come back at me yet with, well, that's just what it's always been. So I guess in that way, I'm using my privilege as one of the older staff members to kind of address that. But it is the same thing. We see and hear these same stories from so many different pockets of kids that to not act on it is irresponsible. And our school mission is educating everyone to their personal excellence. And so that easily ties in with the importance. And so I think being an advocate and in the room, not ignoring the comments and addressing privately or publicly, if you know the person, things that are said or not done, I think is the best way to do that. So personally, I don't know.
Diangelo talks about the importance, actually, whether we agree with that or not is another, but the importance of publicly bringing this up, so to not just to teach that person, but to model it for a group.
And I agree with her 100% in the classroom. If there's a comment made student to student, it's publicly addressed, or if I make an error, it's publicly addressed. But with my peers, that sometimes forces a different reaction, I found. So, you know, I would have to disagree with her maybe on a peer-to-peer basis.
So I'm not seeing any more questions here necessarily, Shawn, in the text box that we didn't address. So
yeah, I just want to give voice to Rosa's point.
Oh, yep, here we are.
She talks about teaching in Latino communities. There's racism, and she's a Mexican teacher and wants to include that in her discussions, and talking about the solidarity that should exist between the needs of Black and Brown communities. And yeah, Diangelo has a whole chapter on the unique nature of anti-Black racism, which yeah, is its own special breed of racism. And yeah, the real need for there to be Black-Brown alliances. We do some work with the Latino Policy Forum, and they do specifically that, very intentional bridge building. But any other thoughts on that would be welcome. Appreciate that point.
I guess I would just turn Rosa's question, if I were asked the question about how to start those conversations between student groups, I personally would have them with student groups separately and try to bring them together. Through our democracy school, we're trying to bring different student groups together to support one another, kind of to advocate students for students, a student voice committee. And we're meeting a lot of success. Students are stepping out of their comfort zone, knowing that then someone from the Pride group is going to come to a BSU meeting just to offer moral support at events. So we went straight to the students in that case and said, what do you need? How would you be comfortable reaching out? And that was the answer we got. If they're supporting me, I will support them. And, you know, baby steps, it's a very public voice right now with calling it short last year, but we're hoping to rekindle that somehow.
I'm really appreciative of Rosa's question about like the second part she asked about like bringing the difficult conversations about race with predominantly Black and brown students.
No.
And I'm just going to plop into the chat box an article or a paper about called Live Civic, and how do we bring identity and race, specifically race and the experiences of our students to civics discussions, whether it's specifically in a civics classroom setting, or to what Mary Ellen says, like all classes should be civics classes, like promoting student voice and agency. So how do we bring a specific lens about race to those conversations to honor the experiences our students have? You know, so many civic texts talk about policy at like a top-down level, and there's so many rich things being done by young people, and specifically young people of color in this moment right now, that we need and can and should highlight. And then just bringing, like, you know, having teaching practices that bring in students' own experiences to the conversations, like let their voices be heard in the conversations. You know, it's like a more co-constructed learning for the students in the room and for the teacher.
Well, Shawn, is that a positive note here to end on,
Yeah.
do you think?
Closing down the joint.
Well, I
right.
have nothing going on this
right.
afternoon. I mean, I'm happy to stay here. I have water. I'm
All right.
I'm
I
good.
used to be a bartender, and one of the things we used to say is, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. So.
Closing time.
Yeah, so again, thank you everybody for participating in this webinar. We really appreciate your questions, your comments, and I hope this is just the beginning of these courageous conversations, and we will be looking at evaluations of those of you doing this for PD credit to kind of see what direction you would like to go next. So be on the lookout for that. So thank you very much and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you all.
And thank you to our panelists.
Thanks. Thanks, you guys. Have a good night.
Thank you. You too.